Welcome to our channel, where history, science, and culture comes alive. Today we explore Ghana's true ancestry through DNA, uncovering hidden migrations, surprising connections, and the rich genetic heritage that shaped the nation. Join us as we decode millennia of history written in the Ghanaian genome.
Deciphering DNA, Ghana's True Ancestry Revealed, Ancient Migrations and Genetic Heritage. Part 1. Origins in Deep Time. Long before kingdoms, trade, and modern nations arose, the story of Ghana's ancestry begins in deep time, inscribed not on parchment or stone but within the molecular fabric of DNA, where every gene carries echoes of ancient survival, migration, and adaptation that unfolded over tens of thousands of years. Long before the word Ghana existed as a cultural or political identity. Archaeological evidence and genetic science together suggest that West Africa has been continuously inhabited for more than 200,000 years, with early human groups adapting to shifting climates, fertile rivers, and savanna landscapes, and it is within this stretch of prehistory that the ancestors of today's Ghanaians carved out their earliest existence, not as a single people but as a constellation of small bands and clans, each moving across forests and plains in search of food, water, and safety. The DNA of modern Ghanaians reveals markers tracing back to the earliest anatomically modern humans, who spread from the eastern regions of Africa toward the west, following rivers such as the Niger and Volta, their presence recorded not by writing but by the genetic footprints they left behind, footprints that show how deeply rooted Ghana's people are within the larger African story, as well as how resilient they were in the face of environmental upheavals like ice age droughts and expanding deserts. At different points in this vast timeline, the Sahara Desert alternated between being a fertile grassland and a barren sea of sand, and each transformation forced migrations that shaped the genetic makeup of West Africa. For when the Sahara bloomed with lakes and rivers, it allowed groups to mix, exchange knowledge, and intermarry, while during the harsh dry phases it became a barrier that isolated populations, preserving unique lineages that remain detectable in Ghanaian genomes today. One of the most remarkable insights from DNA is that the ancestors of Ghanaians were never static, never confined to a single location, but constantly moved, adapted, and mingled with neighboring groups, creating a patchwork of genetic diversity that later became the bedrock of larger civilizations. Mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal ancestry, shows deep lineages that survived in West Africa for tens of thousands of years, evidence of continuity even as the world's geography and climate shifted dramatically. In these early eras, technology was simple yet vital. Stone tools, fire, and the earliest forms of symbolic expression, all of which enabled survival, and while these artifacts often crumble with time, DNA preserves another kind of memory, revealing how certain adaptations, such as resistance to tropical diseases like malaria, emerged early and became encoded in the population, traits that continue to influence health and identity in Ghana today. The forest zones of what is now southern Ghana, rich in biodiversity, acted as both sanctuary and challenge, requiring specialized knowledge of plants, animals, and seasonal cycles, and genetic studies suggest that these ecological pressures left marks on immune system genes, shaping how communities adapted to their environments, embedding survival strategies within the very sequence of their DNA. Meanwhile, the savanna regions to the north provided corridors of movement and contact, linking populations that would later contribute to the formation of great trade routes, but in deep time these landscapes functioned as living laboratories of adaptation, where groups honed their skills in hunting, gathering, and the beginnings of settled life. And it is from these crucibles of adaptation that the foundation of Ghana's ancestral identity was laid. Every modern Ghanaian carries within them fragments of this story, from the hunter-gatherer bands who first shaped the land to the pastoralists and farmers who followed. And while history books often begin with empires, kingdoms, or colonial encounters, DNA reminds us that the roots of Ghanaian identity stretch far deeper, back to a time when survival itself was the central narrative, and communities defined themselves not by borders or rulers but by kinship, shared struggle, and adaptation to ever-changing landscapes. Thus, the origins of Ghana's true ancestry lie not in the rise of kings or the flow of gold but in the enduring resilience of human beings who carried their stories silently within their genes, passing them down through millennia, so that today, when scientists peer into DNA, they find not randomness but echoes of ancient footsteps, migrations across rivers and savannas, adaptations to climate shifts, and the first hints of a people whose identity would one day help shape the history of West Africa. Part 2. Ancient Human Pathways. As the long arc of human history unfolded, the ancestors of modern Ghanaians followed pathways that were not drawn on maps but carved through migration, adaptation, and survival, leaving behind genetic markers that still whisper of journeys taken across rivers, forests, and deserts. Journeys that connected West Africa to the greater human story stretching back to the dawn of our species. Scientists studying DNA evidence find that some of the earliest pathways into the region were traced by groups moving westward from the Rift Valley corridor of East Africa tens of thousands of years ago, carrying with them language roots, cultural practices, and genetic diversity that blended with already settled groups. And these movements remind us that Africa was not divided by impenetrable barriers but linked by corridors of movement that allowed genes, ideas, and tools to spread. Among these corridors, the Niger River Basin and its tributaries played a crucial role, functioning as ancient highways of migration and exchange, and it was along these waterways that genetic lineages traveled, leaving behind patterns detectable today in mitochondrial DNA, which shows maternal lines connecting distant populations from Mali to the Gulf of Guinea, evidence that women in particular carried ancestry across distances, knitting communities into wider regional networks. At the same time, the Great Savanna Belt stretching across West Africa created another set of pathways, where pastoralists drove herds and hunters pursued game, and in this constant movement, genetic blending occurred, producing a tapestry in which no single group remained isolated for long. Yet DNA analysis also reveals unique lineages that hint at moments of separation, when communities adapted in relative isolation, producing traits that still distinguish Ghanaian populations today. One of the most striking genetic signals found in Ghana links to the broader Niger-Congo linguistic family, suggesting that ancient human pathways were not only physical but also cultural, for as people moved, they carried languages that evolved, diversified, and branched into the tongues spoken across West Africa, and DNA evidence shows that this spread was accompanied by the gradual diffusion of farming skills, ironworking techniques, and trade practices, creating a genetic and cultural convergence in the region. The pathways into Ghana also intersected with dramatic environmental shifts, particularly the Sahara's alternating green and arid phases, when lush grasslands invited migration and settlement, only for later desiccation to push groups southward into the forests and along river valleys. And each migration carried genetic footprints into Ghana, blending desert dwellers with forest peoples, herders with fishers, and traders with farmers, producing the varied ancestry that modern testing continues to uncover. Yet these were not one-time movements but recurring flows over thousands of years, as DNA reveals multiple layers of ancestry entering Ghana at different points, some reflecting early hunter-gatherer dispersals, others tied to the later Bantu expansions that spread agricultural practices and new genetic markers into West Africa, and still others linked to trans-Saharan exchanges that predated the rise of great kingdoms, demonstrating that Ghana's ancestry was built through repeated waves of contact rather than a single migration event. The significance of these pathways lies not only in the genes themselves but in what they tell us about human resilience and adaptation, for moving across landscapes meant confronting new climates, diseases, and diets, and genetic studies highlight how traits such as sickle cell adaptation emerged along these routes, shaped by the need to survive malaria-prone zones, leaving behind a genetic imprint that still influences Ghanaian health today. Alongside these biological adaptations, the pathways brought cultural innovations that fused into Ghana's deep heritage, as groups arriving from different directions contributed to spiritual traditions, kinship systems, and social structures. And while much of this early history remains unwritten, DNA provides a silent record that complements archaeology, reminding us that every pathway was more than geography. It was an exchange of identity, knowledge, and resilience that formed the bedrock of Ghana's ancestry. Ultimately, the ancient human pathways that converged in Ghana created a genetic mosaic that defies simple categorization. For modern Ghanaian DNA carries echoes of hunter-gatherers, herders, farmers, and traders, each layer representing a chapter in the larger human story. And what emerges from this record is not isolation but interconnectedness, a reminder that Ghana's people are heirs to countless journeys across deep time, their genes bearing testimony to migrations and meetings that shaped the destiny of a nation long before it was named. Part 3. Echoes of the Sahara. Long before the Sahara became a formidable desert stretching endlessly with dunes and scorching heat, it was a green landscape alive with rivers, lakes, and grasslands, and it was in these fertile epochs that ancestral threads contributing to Ghana's genetic tapestry were woven. For the Sahara was not always a barrier but often a bridge that allowed people, ideas, and genes to flow across vast spaces, leaving echoes that can still be detected in Ghanaian DNA. Archaeological and genetic research reveals that during the so-called Green Sahara periods, which recurred between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, the desert was dotted with lakes larger than modern Lake Victoria, and human communities thrive along their shores, fishing, farming, and herding animals, and these communities moved freely across what is now a forbidding desert. establishing genetic links between populations of North, West, and Central Africa, links that remain visible in modern Ghanaian ancestry. When climate shifts turned the Sahara back into a barren expanse, many of these groups were forced southward, carrying with them not only memories of fertile lands but also genetic signatures that mixed with populations in the Sahel and forest zones, and this southward migration enriched the gene pool of West Africa, contributing to the deep diversity that characterizes Ghana's people today, where genomes carry markers of both local continuity and ancient influxes from regions once connected. Through the Sahara's open corridors. Among the most enduring genetic echoes of these migrations are markers showing affinities between Ghanaian populations and groups further north, suggesting that long before the rise of trade caravans or empires, people moved across the Sahara during its wetter phases, and as they settled in new lands, they carried with them practices of pastoralism, shaping economies and lifestyles in ways that became embedded in cultural traditions as well as DNA. The drying of the Sahara was not simply an environmental crisis but a force that redirected human history, for as water disappeared and grasslands shrank, entire communities were compelled to relocate, creating demographic pressures that reshaped the populations of West Africa, and in Ghana, this meant that incoming groups mixed with indigenous populations, producing unique genetic blends that combined ancient hunter-gatherer lineages with those of migrants from the once green desert. Some genetic studies suggest that this period of migration also accelerated linguistic diversification, for groups forced into new ecological zones developed distinct speech patterns, and over time these became the foundations of the language families that dominate West Africa today, with echoes preserved in Ghana's diverse tongues. DNA analysis complements this by revealing parallel divergences in genetic lineages, showing how environmental upheaval forged not only cultural but also biological identities. The Sahara's transformation also left its mark through selective pressures, as populations moving south into wetter and more tropical environments had to adapt to new diseases and diets, and over generations these adaptations became encoded in the genome, with immune system variations and metabolic adjustments that can still be traced in Ghanaian DNA today, demonstrating how the echoes of an ancient climate shift remain alive in the bodies of modern people. Equally significant is the evidence of ancient genetic links connecting West Africa with populations further east, toward the Nile Valley and the Horn of Africa, ties that were facilitated during the Sahara's green phases when migration routes extended across its fertile plains. And these connections highlight the role of the Sahara not as a divider but as a vast meeting ground whose legacy endures in the shared ancestry between Ghanaians and other African peoples. As the desert hardened into the formidable barrier it is today, those earlier connections did not vanish entirely but were preserved in memory, myth, and bloodlines, and when later historical trade routes emerged across the Sahara, they revived pathways that had already been carved by ancient migrations, creating layers of continuity between prehistoric movements and medieval commerce that reinforced genetic and cultural links between Ghana and regions far beyond its modern borders. Thus, the echoes of the Sahara are not only geological or climatic but deeply human, imprinted within the DNA of Ghana's people as reminders of a time when deserts were lakes, grasslands stretched where dunes now rise, and families wandered freely across spaces that later became insurmountable barriers, and by decoding these echoes, science uncovers how climate shaped ancestry, how migration created diversity, and how the Sahara's shifting face helped forge the resilient genetic identity of Ghana. Part 4. Rivers, Forests, and Settlements. If the Sahara shaped migration through cycles of greening and desiccation, it was the rivers and forests of West Africa that nurtured settlement, stability, and growth, and nowhere is this more evident than in the lands that would one day form Ghana, where the Volta Basin, coastal lagoons, and the dense rainforests created a fertile cradle that preserved ancient lineages and allowed communities to thrive in new ways, embedding both ecological adaptation and social innovation into the DNA of its people. The Volta River system, with its intricate network of tributaries, offered sustenance and connectivity to early populations, and DNA studies reveal that the distribution of genetic markers across Ghana mirrors these river pathways, suggesting that families and clans often followed the watercourses, intermarrying with groups they encountered and thus blending genetic pools along the riverbanks, while archaeological remains of fishing tools and early agricultural implements underscore the intimate relationship between riverine life and human survival. In the southern regions, the forests presented both opportunities and challenges, for they were dense, resource-rich, and demanding, requiring deep ecological knowledge, and the adaptations that emerged here are written in the immune systems of today's Ghanaians, whose genetic resilience against tropical diseases reflects millennia of coexistence with forest environments teeming with insects, parasites, and pathogens, while the ability to utilize forest plants for medicine and sustenance became part of the cultural as well as biological inheritance of these communities. Genetic evidence shows that as groups settled near rivers and within forests, their populations began to expand, leading to greater diversity of lineages within localized regions. And this settlement pattern contrasts with the nomadic movements driven by the Sahara, for here we see continuity and concentration, where maternal and paternal haplogroups reveal long-term residence in specific ecological zones, suggesting that the ancestors of Ghanaians were not only travelers but also builders of enduring communities. Agriculture marked a turning point in this process, as the cultivation of crops such as yams, oil palm, and later millet and sorghum tied populations more firmly to the land. And DNA evidence indicates that farming lifestyles fostered larger, more stable groups whose genetic profiles began to diverge subtly from those of mobile foragers, producing distinct clusters within Ghana that still echo in regional genetic variations today, evidence of how food production transformed ancestry by anchoring families to soil and settlement. The forests and rivers also functioned as natural borders and meeting points, creating spaces where genetic exchange was sometimes restricted and sometimes accelerated. For while dense forests could isolate groups, major river crossings became hubs of contact, trade, and intermarriage, and this interplay of isolation and exchange explains why Ghana's genetic diversity is both deeply local and widely interconnected, a balance between rootedness and openness that reflects centuries of environmental negotiation. Furthermore, the relationship between environment and settlement shaped patterns of kinship and governance that influenced how genes were passed down. For matrilineal traditions, evident in several Ghanaian cultures, may have roots in early settlement dynamics where women's roles in farming and lineage continuity were paramount, and mitochondrial DNA evidence, tracing maternal ancestry, shows striking continuity in some regions, suggesting that these cultural systems reinforced genetic stability across generations. In addition, the adaptation to rivers and forests left an imprint on dietary genes, as populations who relied on starch-heavy diets from root crops developed variations in genes that process carbohydrates, while those who balanced fishing with farming carried distinct nutritional markers, and these subtle biological signatures, still found in Ghanaian DNA, illustrate how settlement and environment intertwine to shape not just identity but the very metabolism of communities. Yet rivers and forests were more than sources of sustenance. They were conduits of myth, spirituality, and cultural identity, and genetic diversity within Ghana today correlates with regions that develop distinct belief systems tied to sacred groves, river spirits, and forest shrines, reminding us that ancestry is not solely biological but also cultural, with DNA and tradition weaving together into the fabric of Ghanaian identity, each reinforcing the other across millennia. Thus, the story of rivers, forests, and settlements is not simply one of geography but of ancestry, for it was in these landscapes that human groups transformed from wanderers into rooted communities, carrying forward adaptations etched into DNA, diversifying into lineages shaped by local ecologies, and building the cultural and biological foundations upon which later civilizations would rise, making Ghana not merely a land of passage but a land of enduring inheritance. Part 5. The Rise of Early Communities. As the rivers carved lifelines through the savannas and the forests yielded food, medicine, and protection, the scattered families of early Ghana began to coalesce into communities whose roots can still be traced in the DNA of their descendants. For it was during this formative period that kinship networks, settlement clusters, and cultural frameworks transformed genetic diversity into structured societies, laying the foundations upon which kingdoms would later rise. Archaeological finds in West Africa, including polished stone tools, pottery fragments, and early agricultural remains, align with genetic studies suggesting that by 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, populations in what is now Ghana had transitioned from loosely connected foraging bands into organized villages, and DNA evidence reflects this transition in the form of increasingly localized haplogroups, markers of families who stayed in one place long enough to leave distinctive genetic imprints that persist in modern populations. The establishment of permanent communities allowed lineages to stabilize, and over generations, specific regions developed unique genetic clusters, revealing that ancestry was not only shared across wide networks but also concentrated in localized populations. And this duality helps explain why modern Ghanaians display both remarkable genetic diversity and identifiable regional patterns. For while long-distance migrations introduced new DNA, the rise of communities ensured the continuity of older lineages. These early settlements were not uniform. Some developed in fertile valleys where agriculture flourished, others along rivers where fishing sustained life, and still others in forest clearings where hunting and gathering remained central, and the genetic evidence supports this ecological variation, showing differences in immune genes, dietary adaptations, and even markers associated with altitude or humidity tolerance, subtle signatures of how different environments shape the biology of Ghana's first settled peoples. Kinship systems emerged as organizing principles within these communities, defining inheritance, social roles, and marriage practices that directly influenced genetic transmission. And in Ghana, matrilineal descent became especially significant, ensuring that mitochondrial DNA lineages maintained continuity over thousands of years, while paternal markers reflect more variability, suggesting mobility of men across groups, a pattern still visible today in the Y chromosome diversity of Ghanaian populations. Cultural traditions began to intertwine with these biological dynamics, for rituals, festivals, and spiritual practices reinforced social bonds that determined who intermarried and who remained separate. And while archaeology provides glimpses of shrines and sacred spaces, DNA reveals the underlying effect of these cultural choices, showing how restricted intermarriage preserved certain lineages, while periods of openness introduced new genetic variations that enriched the communities. Trade, though modest at this early stage, also played a role in shaping ancestry, as communities exchanged goods such as pottery, salt, and food, and with trade came opportunities for intermarriage, producing hybrid lineages detectable in genetic studies, particularly in regions that later became crossroads of larger networks. Evidence that even the smallest villages contributed to the larger mosaic of Ghana's ancestry through their openness to exchange. One of the most profound genetic legacies of these early communities is the adaptation to disease, for settlement brought people into closer contact with one another, creating conditions for the spread of pathogens, and DNA reveals how immune system genes diversified during this era, producing variations that conferred resistance to malaria, sleeping sickness, and other endemic illnesses. A biological inheritance that continues to influence Ghanaian health today, forged in the crucible of early communal life. As populations grew, so too did cultural differentiation, and the genetic record reflects this diversification, with distinct clusters aligning broadly with linguistic families that began to emerge during this period, demonstrating that DNA and language co-evolved as markers of identity, carrying forward both biological and cultural ancestry into the present, where the diversity of Ghana's tongues echoes the ancient branching of genetic lineages across settlements. Thus, the rise of early communities was more than a shift from mobility to permanence. It was the crystallization of ancestry into living societies, each carrying within its DNA the memory of ancient migrations, environmental adaptations, and cultural choices, and from these roots grew the lineages that would later converge into chiefdoms, kingdoms, and empires. But even before those great political entities emerged, Ghana's true ancestry was already written in the quiet persistence of its earliest villages. Part 6. Gold, Salt, and Genetic Exchange. As early villages matured into more structured societies, the lure of resources transformed Ghana's landscapes into hubs of exchange, and none proved more influential than the glimmer of gold beneath the soil and the vital grains of salt carried across the desert. For these commodities did more than fuel economies, they reshaped ancestry, weaving external influences into Ghana's genetic tapestry and linking its people to far-reaching networks that extended across Africa and beyond. Gold had long been gathered in streams and riverbeds by local communities, but as knowledge of its abundance spread, it became a magnet for merchants and travelers, drawing in people from neighboring regions who intermarried with local populations, leaving genetic traces that still appear in Ghanaian DNA today, markers of contact that correspond with archaeological finds of ornaments and trade goods exchanged long before the rise of the medieval Ghana Empire. Salt, the other side of this vital equation, flowed southward from the Sahara, carried by nomadic traders who crossed harsh landscapes to reach fertile zones. And with each caravan came not only the mineral that preserved food and sustained health but also fresh waves of ancestry, for traders often settled in the communities they served, marrying locally and embedding their lineages into the population, a process that science now uncovers in the subtle signatures of Y chromosome diversity in northern Ghana. The exchange of gold and salt thus became an engine of genetic blending, and mitochondrial DNA evidence shows maternal lineages reflecting both deep local continuity and influxes from Sahelian and even North African populations, suggesting that women, too, played active roles in this web of exchange, either as part of migrating families or as central figures in intermarriage alliances that cemented trade relationships, ensuring that ancestry was intertwined with commerce. These trade routes did not only bring people but also ideas, technologies, and diseases, all of which left marks on Ghana's ancestry. For the spread of ironworking, for example, coincided with genetic signals of new population movements, while the introduction of pathogens like smallpox created selective pressures that shaped immune system variations, meaning that the genes of today's Ghanaians still carry the echoes of ancient exchanges conducted under the banner of gold and salt. Cultural blending followed the same patterns as genetic blending, with northern influences introducing new forms of governance, religion, and artistry, which, when adapted by local populations, produced distinctive Ghanaian traditions, And genetic evidence supports this cultural hybridity by revealing layers of ancestry from multiple directions, each wave adding depth to the mosaic without erasing the foundational lineages that had endured since deep time. The flow of gold outward and salt inward also connected Ghana to broader regional economies, tying its people to the Sahel, the Sahara, and eventually to transcontinental networks, and DNA provides evidence of these connections, showing shared markers between Ghanaians and populations as far afield as Berber groups of North Africa, demonstrating that trade was never purely material but also biological, exchanging bloodlines along with goods. This genetic exchange did not occur evenly. Regions closer to trade corridors show higher levels of admixture, while more isolated forest communities preserve unique lineages, a contrast that remains evident in modern DNA studies, highlighting the uneven but transformative impact of gold and salt on ancestry. For while some communities became melting pots, others became living repositories of older genetic signatures that might otherwise have disappeared. The wealth generated by gold also had demographic effects, as it encouraged population growth and the consolidation of settlements into larger centers, and these demographic shifts amplified the opportunities for genetic mixing, producing more complex lineages that blended local, Sahelian, and Saharan ancestry, all of which contributed to the diversity that characterizes Ghana today, showing how resources shape not only economies but also identities. Ultimately, the story of gold and salt is a story of connection, for these commodities created pathways that carried genes as surely as they carried goods, and the DNA of modern Ghanaians still reflects this legacy, bearing witness to centuries of exchange that linked rivers and deserts, villages and caravans, ancestors and strangers, until the genetic tapestry became a rich weave of continuity and change, resilience and openness, making Ghana's ancestry not only local but cosmopolitan long before global empires emerged. Part 7. The Silent DNA of Migrations. While gold and salt carved visible routes of trade, there were countless other migrations into Ghana that left no monuments or written records, movements remembered not in chronicles but preserved silently within DNA, for genes hold the imprints of travelers, settlers, and wanderers whose names are forgotten yet whose biological legacies remain woven into the ancestry of modern Ghanaians. Some of these migrations came with the great Bantu expansions, when farming populations spread gradually from Central Africa into the West, carrying with them not only new crops and iron technologies but also distinct genetic markers that today form a significant layer in Ghanaian DNA, and though the details of their paths are often obscured, genomic analysis reveals shared haplogroups between Ghanaian populations and distant groups across Africa's equatorial belt, silent testimony to journeys that reshaped the continent. Other migrations were smaller, slower, and more subtle, involving pastoralist groups who moved southward with their herds in response to shifting climates, mingling with established communities along the savanna fringes, and genetic studies suggest that paternal lineages in northern Ghana bear traces of these pastoralist ancestries, evidence of intermarriage between mobile herders and settled farmers, a quiet but enduring blending of identities that reshaped family lineages. There were also westward flows from the Nile Valley and Lake Chad Basin, regions that connected Africa's interior with the West long before historical empires arose, and DNA reveals echoes of these migrations in the presence of genetic markers linked to populations far beyond Ghana's borders, subtle signatures that speak of ancient exchanges facilitated by rivers, shared grazing lands, and temporary alliances forged through necessity, leaving behind a patchwork of ancestry invisible to archaeology alone. One of the most fascinating aspects of these silent migrations is how they layered ancestry without erasing older lineages, for genetic evidence shows that while new populations contributed their DNA, ancient hunter-gatherer lineages persisted, especially in maternal lines, creating a living record of continuity that resisted complete assimilation. And this persistence underscores the resilience of Ghana's earliest peoples, whose genetic voices still speak beneath the louder echoes of later arrivals. The silent DNA of migrations also records the movement of ideas and practices, for genetic studies indicate correlations between shifts in ancestry and the adoption of farming, ironworking, or livestock management, suggesting that people did not merely exchange goods but carried whole ways of life with them, embedding cultural transformations into the genome itself, where they remain detectable thousands of years later. These migrations were not always voluntary. Some may have been driven by conflict, drought, or disease, circumstances that forced groups to relocate and seek refuge in new lands, and DNA reveals the demographic impact of such upheavals and sudden shifts in population structure, where genetic bottlenecks or bursts of admixture tell stories of survival and adaptation that written history never recorded but that science can now uncover. Not all movements left equal marks, for while some migrations produced lasting genetic integration, others were transient, their lineages fading over time as small groups were absorbed or their descendants gradually blended into larger populations. And this selective visibility in DNA explains why some ancestral contributions stand out strongly while others appear only as faint traces. Whispers of forgotten peoples who nonetheless shaped Ghana's story. The silent DNA of migrations also highlights the role of women in ancestry, for mitochondrial studies show how maternal lineages carried across distances often endured more strongly than paternal ones, suggesting that women were central to the integration of newcomers, whether through marriage alliances, settlement, or childbearing within host communities. And their enduring genetic presence reveals the hidden but crucial role of women in knitting together diverse populations. Thus, when we examine Ghana's DNA today, we see not only the legacies of kingdoms, trade routes, or colonization, but also the faint yet persistent signatures of unrecorded migrations, movements that left no written trace but indelibly shaped ancestry, reminding us that history is not only what is remembered but also what is carried silently in the body. And in Ghana, that silent DNA tells of countless journeys, forgotten wanderers, and hidden integrations that together created one of the richest genetic tapestries on the African continent. Part 8. Dynasties and the Bloodline. When the scattered communities of ancient Ghana matured into organized states, new layers of ancestry were forged not through migration alone but through dynasties, for leadership, succession, and political consolidation shaped who intermarried, who held power, and whose lineages became dominant, and these dynastic choices etched themselves into the genetic heritage of Ghana's people as firmly as trade and climate had done before. The earliest Ghanaian polities, including the rise of the Ghana Empire in the Sahel, relied heavily on kinship structures, where rulers traced authority through specific family lines, and DNA evidence suggests that such dynastic systems left measurable imprints, as elite lineages often engaged in strategic marriages that connected ruling families to broader populations, blending ancestry while ensuring continuity of power across generations. In matrilineal traditions, particularly among Akan-speaking peoples, women carried dynastic authority, and mitochondrial DNA studies show extraordinary continuity of maternal lineages across centuries, suggesting that the emphasis on maternal descent preserved ancient genetic lines, embedding them deeply in the population, while paternal markers reveal more fluidity, reflecting the role of men in forging alliances across communities, a duality that still shapes Ghana's genetic landscape. Dynasties also drew new blood into their fold, for rulers often married beyond their immediate groups to cement alliances, incorporate outsiders, or strengthen trade relationships, and this practice introduced genetic diversity into the upper strata of society, diversity that later filtered into the broader population as royal families intermingled with commoners, producing a dynamic interplay between political strategy and biological inheritance. The influence of dynasties can also be seen in the geographic distribution of ancestry, as ruling houses anchored their courts in specific regions, attracting settlers, artisans, and warriors, all of whom contributed their genes to the local population, creating areas with distinctive genetic profiles tied to centers of power, a phenomenon still visible today in subtle regional differences across Ghana's genome. The consolidation of dynastic power often involved conquest, and genetic evidence suggests that such conflicts left traces in population shifts, with Y chromosome markers revealing male-dominated influxes associated with warrior elites, while maternal lineages reflect greater stability, suggesting that women remained in place even as ruling dynasties changed, ensuring continuity of ancestry despite political upheaval, a pattern echoed across Africa's ancient states. Religious authority reinforced dynastic claims, and with it came ritual intermarriage and the preservation of priestly lineages, which genetic studies suggest maintained unique haplogroups across centuries, acting as living repositories of ancestry tied to spiritual as well as political power. And these sacred lineages contributed to the complex interplay of continuity and change that defined Ghana's dynastic era. Dynasties also acted as custodians of migration, for rulers often encouraged or controlled the movement of people to consolidate territory, whether through resettling conquered populations, inviting skilled workers, or fostering trade colonies, and these policies introduced new genetic influences while also concentrating existing ones, producing demographic shifts that are now visible in the DNA of modern Ghanaians. One striking example of dynastic impact is the persistence of noble lineages in oral traditions, many of which find echoes in genetic studies that reveal unusually strong continuity of certain haplogroups within regions associated with historical ruling houses, suggesting that ancestry and memory work together to preserve dynastic legacies, embedding them both in culture and in biology. Thus, dynasties were not only political structures but also biological engines, shaping who mixed, who endured, and who carried forward their genes, and in Ghana, the bloodlines of rulers intertwined with the broader population to create a genetic record of power, alliance, and continuity, a record that still resonates in the DNA of today's people, linking them to centuries of dynastic rule that silently guided the flow of ancestry. Part 9. The Atlantic Currents of Change. The turning of the 15th century brought Ghana into contact with forces that would transform its genetic landscape forever. For with the arrival of Portuguese ships along the Gulf of Guinea, and later Dutch, English, and Danish vessels, came an unprecedented wave of exchanges, displacements, and connections across the Atlantic world, weaving Ghana's DNA into a much wider tapestry that spanned oceans and continents. At first, these currents manifested through coastal trade, where European merchants bartered for gold, ivory, and spices, and in the process introduced small but detectable genetic influences. For some traders and settlers established relationships with local women, leaving traces of southern European ancestry in coastal populations, ancestry that remains faint but measurable in mitochondrial DNA today. But soon the Atlantic currents carried darker consequences, as the transatlantic slave trade redefined human movement on a scale previously unimaginable, drawing millions from West Africa, including the lands of present-day Ghana, across the ocean to the Americas, while simultaneously reshaping the gene pool of the homeland. For the extraction of so many young men and women left demographic scars that reshaped inheritance patterns for centuries. The genetic effects of the slave trade are not confined to the diaspora, for the loss of such a large proportion of Ghana's population altered the balance of local lineages, amplifying the influence of those groups less affected by capture or displacement, while weakening others, and DNA evidence suggests that this demographic bottleneck left subtle but lasting imprints in haplogroup frequencies across the region. Paradoxically, the same Atlantic system that drained Ghana of people also introduced new ancestries, as coastal forts, garrisons, and settlements became melting pots of African, European, and even Asian lineages. For Portuguese traders brought Cape Verdeans and Sephardic Jews, the Dutch employed South Asian soldiers, and the British moved people between colonies, all of which injected unexpected genetic signatures into Ghanaian populations living near the coast. Within Ghana, these Atlantic entanglements were uneven, for coastal towns bore the brunt of foreign contact, displaying the strongest evidence of mixed ancestry, while inland populations retained more continuity, preserving older genetic structures. Yet over time intermarriage and migration blurred these boundaries, dispersing foreign influences beyond the shoreline and embedding them into Ghana's broader genetic story. The Atlantic currents also reshaped internal movements, for communities sought refuge from slave raiding by moving deeper into forests or mountains, creating new settlements where genetic lineages clustered differently, while others migrated toward coastal towns to benefit from trade. And these choices are still visible in DNA as patterns of isolation or convergence between groups that shifted their geography in response to Atlantic forces. The trauma of the slave trade also left cultural and biological echoes, for oral histories recall the loss of kin and entire villages, while genetic studies reveal missing lineages that appear in African-descended populations in the Americas but are rare in modern Ghana, a haunting reminder that parts of Ghana's ancestry live abroad, preserved in the diaspora even as they diminished at home. Conversely, genetic continuity between Ghanaians and African Americans, Afro-Brazilians, and Caribbean peoples affirms enduring connections, showing that despite centuries of separation, the Atlantic did not sever ancestral bonds, for shared haplogroups and autosomal markers bridge the ocean, reminding us that Ghana's genetic story is not confined within its borders but resonates across continents, binding together communities long divided by forced migration. Yet the Atlantic currents were not only about loss, for they also seeded resilience, as surviving communities reorganized, intermarried, and adapted, blending lineages that might otherwise have remained apart, and in this crucible of hardship and adaptation, new genetic combinations were forged, laying the groundwork for the diversity and strength of modern Ghanaian ancestry, shaped as much by endurance as by trauma. Thus, the Atlantic era inscribed its legacy in Ghana's DNA, not only through traces of foreign admixture or the scars of depopulation, but also through the resilience of surviving lineages that carried forward their ancestry despite immense disruption, ensuring that Ghana's genetic tapestry remained whole even as it was stretched across oceans, an enduring testament to both suffering and survival in the face of Atlantic currents that reshaped the very destiny of a people. Part 10. Colonial Shadows and Gene Flow. When the 19th century drew its long shadow over Ghana, the Atlantic slave trade gave way to colonial conquest, and with it came a new chapter in the shaping of ancestry, for the establishment of British rule after centuries of coastal competition by Portuguese, Dutch, and Danes created new structures of governance, labor, and settlement that would leave their own genetic fingerprints on Ghana's people. Unlike the chaotic violence of the slave raids, colonialism restructured movement in more systematic ways, establishing administrative centers, mission schools, and military garrisons that concentrated populations in particular towns, creating genetic mixing points where people from different ethnic and regional groups met, intermarried, and left behind lineages that reflected the colonial geography of rule. One major influence came through urbanization, for cities such as Accra, Cape Coast, and Kumasi expanded rapidly under colonial administration, drawing migrants from every corner of Ghana, and genetic studies show how these urban centers became microcosms of national diversity, dissolving older patterns of isolation and accelerating admixture between groups that once remained distinct, a process still visible in modern Ghana's urban populations. Another colonial force was missionary activity, which not only transformed religion and education but also shifted population dynamics, for mission schools attracted pupils from different regions, who often stayed to work, marry, and settle near mission centers, blending lineages across ethnic lines, while the presence of European missionaries and teachers introduced faint but detectable traces of foreign DNA, particularly in coastal areas. Colonial labor systems also reshaped genetics, for the British recruited Ghanaian soldiers for regiments deployed across West Africa, and many returned with spouses or descendants from Sierra Leone, Nigeria, or beyond, leaving evidence of pan-West African ancestry embedded within Ghana's genome, while cocoa plantations in the south drew waves of internal migrants, concentrating diverse lineages in areas of agricultural wealth. Intermarriage between Europeans and Ghanaians continued under colonial rule, though often under unequal power relations, and genetic evidence indicates that these unions, while limited in number, contributed to the admixture already present from earlier centuries, producing small but enduring lines of mixed ancestry that survive today, particularly along the coast, where forts once stood as symbols of empire. Colonial infrastructure projects such as railways and roads also facilitated mobility, breaking down barriers of distance and encouraging new migrations, for people from the north traveled south in greater numbers, and DNA analysis confirms how this internal movement diversified the genetic pool of southern Ghana, blending northern haplogroups with coastal ones and reinforcing Ghana's identity as a meeting ground of lineages. At the same time, colonial borders redefined identity, for the artificial boundaries of British rule incorporated peoples whose kin stretched beyond Ghana's modern limits, ensuring that Ghanaian ancestry would remain intertwined with that of neighboring Togo, Côte d'Ivoire, and Burkina Faso, and genetic studies affirm this, revealing close affinities across borders that testify to shared lineages divided by colonial maps. Colonial health campaigns, while designed to combat diseases such as sleeping sickness or yellow fever, also shaped demographic patterns, for resettlement into new towns or protected zones clustered populations in novel ways, mixing lineages that might otherwise have remained apart, while survival pressures altered the frequency of genetic traits associated with resistance to malaria and other endemic diseases. Yet colonialism also brought disruption, for forced labor, taxation, and famine displaced families, fracturing lineages and reshaping demographic balances, while resistance movements and migration to escape colonial demands left their own traces in genetic dispersal, reminding us that ancestry was not merely blended under colonial shadows but also fractured, scattered, and reconstituted in cycles of adaptation. By the time independence arrived in 1957, Ghana's genome bore the legacy of colonialism. Admixture from urbanization, faint foreign contributions, the integration of northern and southern lineages, and the enduring imprints of forced and voluntary migrations, all woven together into a fabric that was neither erased by empire nor wholly defined by it, but instead reflected the resilience of Ghana's people in preserving their identity while absorbing the genetic consequences of colonial shadows. Part 11. Resistance and Cultural Memory. If colonial rule imposed new structures on Ghana, it was the spirit of resistance and the preservation of cultural memory that sustained the people through those years, and this resilience left not only marks in history but also traces in DNA, for ancestry does not survive merely through birth but through the deliberate safeguarding of kinship, heritage, and continuity, and in Ghana, these acts of resistance were as vital as any biological inheritance. Resistance unfolded in many forms, from open revolts such as the Asante Wars against the British to the quiet strategies of cultural endurance practiced in villages, where oral traditions, proverbs, and ritual practices preserved ancestral connections even when colonial authorities sought to suppress them, and through this preservation, communities ensured that lineage ties and marital customs continued, anchoring the transmission of DNA within cultural frameworks that guarded continuity. Oral traditions played a particularly critical role, for while genes carried biological ancestry, storytelling carried its meaning, and lineages were remembered through praise songs, genealogies, and festival rituals, reinforcing who belonged to whom and which families carried which legacy, and these narratives, by protecting the importance of ancestry, influenced marriage choices that sustained the genetic identity of ethnic groups across centuries of disruption. Among the Akan, the persistence of matrilineal inheritance acted as a bulwark against colonial attempts to impose patriarchal laws, ensuring that maternal lineages remained intact, and mitochondrial DNA studies confirm the deep continuity of maternal haplogroups across generations, evidence of how cultural resistance protected biological inheritance, keeping ancient maternal lines strong despite external pressures. Even in the face of migration, resistance preserved ancestry. For communities displaced by railroads, plantations, or taxation often recreated their kinship structures in new locations, ensuring that intermarriage remained guided by cultural boundaries that maintained continuity of identity, and genetic evidence shows how such relocations preserved rather than erased lineage markers, reflecting the strength of cultural cohesion. Resistance was also embodied in spiritual practices. For shrines, priesthoods, and initiation rites safeguarded sacred lineages, where particular families were entrusted with ritual roles that were passed down carefully, ensuring the preservation of unique haplogroups tied to spiritual authority, and DNA studies reveal such continuity, linking modern Ghanaian families with ancestral priestly lineages preserved through deliberate cultural fidelity. The memory of slavery and colonial exploitation, though painful, became itself a source of cohesion, for oral accounts of raids, captives, and losses were preserved to remind descendants of their heritage, and this memory shaped how communities protected themselves, strengthening bonds that ensured survival and reproduction within trusted kin networks, leaving behind patterns of genetic continuity despite historical trauma. Resistance also manifested through interethnic alliances, as groups facing common colonial pressures intermarried to strengthen solidarity, weaving together lineages that created new blends of ancestry. Yet these alliances were deliberate acts of survival rather than passive mixing, and in this way, DNA reflects not only biological processes but also conscious decisions rooted in resistance and adaptation. The struggles of independence further deepened the role of cultural memory, for nationalist leaders drew upon ancestral symbols, oral histories, and ethnic pride to unify diverse populations, and in doing so they reaffirmed the importance of ancestry as a shared inheritance, ensuring that DNA was not seen as a relic of the past but as a living testament to survival, continuity, and unity. Thus, the story of Ghana's resistance is not only political but genetic, for through cultural memory, kinship systems, oral traditions, and spiritual guardianship, lineages were shielded against erasure, ensuring that the DNA of today's Ghanaians carries within it not merely the silent record of migrations and admixture, but the indelible imprint of a people who resisted, remembered, and preserved their ancestral inheritance against all odds. Part 12. Postcolonial Identity in DNA. When Ghana emerged as the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence in 1957, the event was not only a political triumph but also a new turning point in the shaping of identity. For post-colonial Ghana carried within it both the genetic legacies of millennia and the fresh challenge of weaving them into a coherent national story. And DNA provides a powerful lens through which to trace how ancestry intertwined with modern identity. The excitement of independence fostered unprecedented internal mobility, as education, civil service, and commerce drew people from villages into cities, and cities into one another, creating networks of intermarriage that blurred regional and ethnic boundaries, producing genetic admixture on a scale greater than colonial times, as northern, coastal, and forest populations increasingly shared both marriages and lineages. Post-colonial identity also deepened ties with the diaspora, for Ghana became a symbol of Pan-African pride, welcoming people of African descent from the Americas and the Caribbean, some of whom settled, intermarried, and brought new lineages back into the homeland, and DNA studies reveal faint echoes of these exchanges, particularly in urban areas where Afro-Caribbean or African-American settlers left descendants. Migration within West Africa likewise intensified, for Ghana's economic strength in the 1960s and 1970s attracted workers from Togo, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and beyond, and these communities, while sometimes temporary, contributed genetic influences through intermarriage, embedding Ghana's genome ever more firmly within a pan-West African context, reflecting shared ancestry that transcended colonial borders. Yet post-colonial identity was not only about blending but also about remembering, for ethnic groups such as the Yu, Ga, Akan, and Dagomba continued to preserve distinct cultural and lineage practices, ensuring that while the nation moved toward unity, genetic patterns still reflected continuity of ancestral lines, with haplogroup distributions preserving echoes of ancient migrations even as admixture increased. Education further accelerated these dynamics, for boarding schools, universities, and scholarship programs concentrated youth from diverse ethnicities, and the marriages and friendships formed in these institutions became powerful engines of genetic exchange, dissolving old barriers and producing families whose ancestry spanned multiple ethnic identities, creating a genetic mirror of national integration. Post-colonial challenges such as coups, economic hardship, and migration abroad also reshaped DNA, for large waves of Ghanaians moved to Europe, North America, and other parts of Africa, forming diaspora communities whose descendants now carry Ghanaian lineages abroad, and in turn, return migration has reintroduced new genetic combinations, as second-generation migrants marry into Ghanaian families, knitting global ancestries into the nation's genome. The persistence of matrilineal and patrilineal traditions continued to influence which lineages endured most visibly, for in matrilineal Akan societies, mitochondrial continuity remained strong, while patrilineal groups reflected greater fluidity, and together these dual systems balanced continuity with adaptability, producing a genetic heritage that carried deep stability alongside openness to change. Religion also played a role in shaping post-colonial ancestry, for the spread of Christianity and Islam encouraged new forms of identity and intermarriage, often bridging ethnic lines, while traditional spiritual practices preserved sacred lineages, ensuring that both continuity and diversity were fostered simultaneously, a pattern mirrored in the genetic signatures of contemporary Ghanaians. Thus, post-colonial identity in DNA reflects not only the biological mixing of peoples in cities, schools, and workplaces, but also the conscious effort to create a unified national identity, one that embraced diversity while rooting itself in continuity, ensuring that Ghana's genome today is both ancient and modern, deeply tied to ancestral origins yet enriched by the exchanges of a post-colonial world that celebrated unity through diversity. Part 13. Science unlocks the genome. The 21st century ushered in a revolution for understanding ancestry, for while oral tradition and archaeology had long provided clues to Ghana's past, it was modern science, armed with the tools of genetics, that began to unlock the genome itself, turning strands of DNA into historical texts written in the language of nucleotides, and offering revelations that reframed how Ghanaians could see themselves and their place in human history. Genomic studies revealed the deep antiquity of Ghana's population, showing that lineages within the region stretched back tens of thousands of years, confirming that West Africa was not merely a corridor for human migration but a cradle of sustained habitation, where genetic diversity accumulated over millennia, making Ghana one of the richest reservoirs of human variation in the world. Advanced sequencing highlighted the resilience of maternal haplogroups such as L0, L1, and L2, demonstrating the extraordinary continuity of maternal ancestry across time, while paternal markers traced the flows of migration from the Sahel, Sahara, and even distant Nile Valley, confirming that Ghana's genome carried imprints of both local continuity and long-distance interaction. Science also uncovered the genetic impact of ancient environmental shifts, for DNA revealed how populations expanded during wetter periods and contracted during droughts, correlating genetic bottlenecks with episodes of desertification or climate upheaval, turning the genome into a chronicle of ecological change that had shaped human survival and settlement across Ghana's landscapes. One of the most striking findings came through the study of admixture, for Ghanaian DNA showed clear signals of historic contact with North African, Middle Eastern, and European populations, confirming what oral tradition and archaeology had long suggested: that Ghana's people were never isolated, but deeply enmeshed in networks of trade, migration, and exchange that stretched far beyond West Africa. Medical genomics added another dimension, for studies of Ghanaian DNA revealed adaptations to malaria and other endemic diseases, showing how selective pressures shaped immunity and survival, while at the same time exposing vulnerabilities to conditions such as sickle cell disease, demonstrating the double-edged legacy of genetic adaptation, where traits that once protected against infection carried modern health challenges. Science also illuminated the scars of history, for population genetics identified signals of the Atlantic slave trade, detecting lineages in the diaspora that traced directly to Ghana, and revealing missing haplogroups at home that persisted abroad, offering tangible evidence of the demographic trauma carried in DNA, while also affirming the resilience of lineages that endured. With new technology such as whole genome sequencing, scientists could even map fine-scale population structure, identifying subtle genetic differences between coastal, forest, and savanna communities, yet also showing how these distinctions blurred in urban areas, confirming the accelerating admixture of modern Ghana as people from every background came together in cities, marriages, and shared identities. Beyond ancestry, genomic science carried profound implications for identity and heritage, for it allowed Ghanaians in the diaspora to trace their roots with greater accuracy, reconnecting families separated for centuries, and at the same time enabling communities within Ghana to affirm the depth of their historical presence, grounding cultural pride in biological continuity that stretched across time. Thus, science did not replace oral tradition but enriched it, providing molecular evidence that confirmed, clarified, or expanded ancestral memory, turning Ghana's genome into both a scientific archive and a cultural inheritance, a reminder that the strands of DNA in every Ghanaian carry not only biological information but the story of a people whose ancestry is among the most ancient, diverse, and enduring on Earth. Part 14. The Pan-African Genetic Mosaic. To understand Ghana's ancestry is also to recognize its place within the wider African genetic mosaic, for DNA does not stop at borders drawn by colonial powers but flows across savannas, forests, rivers, and deserts, weaving together lineages that bind Ghana to the continent at large, and genetic research shows how deeply Ghana participates in Africa's shared inheritance. West Africa emerges as one of the most genetically diverse regions on Earth, and within it, Ghana reflects both local depth and continental connections. For studies reveal that haplogroups found among Ghanaians also appear across the Sahel, Nigeria, the Congo Basin, and even in North and East Africa, testifying to ancient migrations that link peoples across vast distances. The Sahelian connection is particularly strong, for DNA evidence shows repeated waves of interaction between savanna dwellers and forest communities, with genetic markers in northern Ghana linking to groups in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, affirming the historic corridors of trade, conquest, and kinship that tied Ghana to the heart of the Sahel. Equally significant are the links to the Niger-Congo linguistic family, for genetic studies confirm that the Great Bantu expansions carried lineages from West Africa across the continent, and echoes of these origins still reverberate in Ghana's genome, anchoring it as part of the ancestral homeland from which millions of Africans trace their descent. Connections to North Africa and the Nile Valley also appear in genetic signals, revealing admixture from trans-Saharan movements that brought not only goods and ideas but also genes, blending Ghanaian ancestry with lineages from Berber, Arab, and other North African groups, embedding Ghana firmly within the broader Afro-Eurasian sphere while preserving its unique identity. Modern Pan-Africanism finds its parallel in these ancient genetic ties, for just as political leaders like Kwame Nkrumah envisioned African unity, so too does DNA testify to the shared biological foundation of African peoples, demonstrating that despite cultural and linguistic differences, the continent's populations remain profoundly interconnected at the genetic level. The African diaspora strengthens this mosaic further, for Ghanaians share ancestry with African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Afro-Brazilians whose genomes preserve the imprint of West African origins, and DNA analysis not only reunites these lineages but also affirms Ghana's role as both homeland and crossroads in the genetic story of Africa. Even health genomics illustrates this mosaic, for genetic traits studied in Ghana often parallel those found across the continent, from resistance to malaria in West and Central Africa to lactose tolerance in some pastoralist-linked groups, showing how adaptive lineages spread and converged across populations, weaving together survival strategies that transcend national boundaries. Yet Ghana's contribution to the African mosaic is not merely one among many, but a central thread, for its location between Sahel and forest, between coast and interior, positioned it as a hub of exchange for millennia, and genetic studies confirm that Ghana's people carry signatures of both stability and movement, acting as a bridge between Africa's diverse genetic regions. Thus, the Ghanaian genome tells not only the story of a nation but also the wider story of Africa, a mosaic of lineages, migrations, and adaptations that together reveal the shared destiny of the continent, where every gene is both uniquely local and profoundly Pan-African, carrying echoes of the journeys, struggles, and triumphs that bind Africa as one. Part 15. Ghana's Future Through Ancestry. The journey of Ghana's ancestry, traced from deep time through dynasties, migrations, trade, slavery, colonialism, and independence, now turns toward the future. For DNA is not only a record of the past but a guide to what lies ahead, and in Ghana, the genome is emerging as a vital resource for health, identity, and unity in a rapidly changing world. One of the most immediate futures of ancestry lies in medicine, for genetic research in Ghana is beginning to reveal how inherited traits shape responses to disease, from resistance to malaria to predispositions for hypertension and diabetes, and as science advances, Ghanaian genomes may guide precision medicine tailored to local populations, ensuring that healthcare reflects both global knowledge and ancestral inheritance. Equally significant is the role of ancestry in reconnecting communities, for DNA testing now allows members of the African diaspora to trace their roots back to Ghana, strengthening cultural bonds that centuries of forced migration had severed, and this growing reconnection offers Ghana the chance to serve as a bridge between Africa and its diaspora, uniting families separated by oceans but joined by shared bloodlines. Ancestry also shapes national identity in the face of globalization, for as migration, urbanization, and intermarriage accelerate, Ghana's DNA will continue to diversify, creating new blends that reflect a modern, cosmopolitan society, yet within this blending, the deep continuity of ancient lineages remains, reminding Ghanaians that their future is rooted in one of the oldest and richest genetic tapestries on Earth. Technology ensures that ancestry will no longer remain hidden, for genomic databases, sequencing initiatives, and international collaborations are rapidly expanding knowledge of Ghana's DNA, and these efforts promise not only to illuminate history but also to inspire pride, as every discovery affirms the central role of Ghana in humanity's story, positioning the nation as a leader in the scientific exploration of ancestry. The future of ancestry also lies in education, for young Ghanaians exposed to the science of genetics will not only learn about their origins but also see how their biology connects them to both Africa and the world, fostering a sense of belonging that transcends borders while deepening pride in heritage, and in this way, DNA becomes a tool for cultural empowerment. Ancestral knowledge may also guide environmental and social resilience, for genetic adaptations to climate, diet, and disease hold clues to how future generations can navigate challenges, while oral traditions that preserved ancestry across centuries remain vital for grounding science and culture, ensuring that the future of Ghanaian identity is not reduced to data but enriched by memory. At the same time, the future brings ethical challenges, for as genetic information becomes more widely available, questions of privacy, ownership, and representation must be addressed, ensuring that Ghanaians themselves control how their DNA is studied and shared, and that the benefits of ancestry research flow back to the communities whose bloodlines preserve humanity's history. The global significance of Ghana's ancestry will only grow, for as geneticists continue to study African genomes to unlock insights into human evolution, Ghana's extraordinary diversity and depth of lineages will play a central role, making the nation not only a participant but a leader in reshaping humanity's understanding of its origins and its destiny. Thus, Ghana's future through ancestry is one of possibility, where DNA serves as a bridge between past and present, between homeland and diaspora, between science and culture, and between local resilience and global knowledge, ensuring that the people of Ghana step into the future not as inheritors of a fractured past but as custodians of one of the most profound and enduring genetic legacies in the world.
Thank you for watching. We hope this journey into Ghana's ancestral DNA has inspired you to see history in a new light. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories from around the world. Together, let's keep discovering the secret hidden in our past.